Hello and welcome to Into the Mythic. This week's episode is a very wide-ranging discussion about different aspects of winter in ancient society and how that seasonal shift is reflected in our myths and storytelling. We touch on everything from Bog Bodies to cattle raiding, the Cailleach in Scotland, and Fionn McCool and the Fianna. This episode was recorded in the Working Artists Studios in Ballydehob in front of an avid audience of local myth lovers, so there's a bit of conversation and reflection amongst the group too. This is the last episode of our second series, but I'm happy to say that thanks to our friends at Wild Goose Craft Studio in Kinsale, we'll be back with a third series shortly. Meanwhile, Pól and I are doing a bit of a spin-off on Patreon. We decided to investigate some of the Brehon laws to see what they can tell us about the ancient Irish psyche. The Brehon laws governed Ireland for thousands of years. They were an incredibly complex and comprehensive legal system that made provision for every possible eventuality in great detail. In our first episode, we look at marriage under the Brehon system, and we discuss the fact that there were 10 different kinds of marriage allowed for, seemingly without any moral judgment on people's preferred choice of relationship. If you want to find out more, the link to the Patreon is in the programme notes, or you can just search Into the Mythic on Patreon. If you've enjoyed what we've been doing with the podcast over the last couple of years, I think you'll enjoy this new content. There are 4 new episodes there at the moment, and I have to say it's been really fascinating hearing about how different things were valued and understood in ancient Irish society. For example, a purring cat that would also catch mice was thought to be worth 2.5 goats, and a high-ranking poet was the equal of a king. But for now, back to the Working Artists Studios in Ballydehob and our multi-layered conversation about winter in the ancient psyche.
Well, even in the modern world, midwinter, winter happens and it gets darker and darker, earlier and earlier. And in the old days, work more or less ceased because people had small farms. And so they had long periods of sitting around in the dark, doing nothing, more or less nothing. They were doing things, but you know what I mean. So, this was the time for stories. There probably wasn't very much storytelling during the summer months because everyone was very busy ploughing and sowing and reaping and all this kind of stuff, looking after cattle. But in the winter time, people would, you know yourself, it gets dark at 4:30, 4:45. Then you have your dinner or your tea, whatever it is, and then you start to fall asleep by the fire. So the only way to stay awake is to call to a neighbour's house. And the only way to stay awake there is to tell stories, riddles, tongue twisters, songs, dance, all this kind of thing. In the summer, there are periods where you have dancing. There are special high points. But in the winter, it's long. And it goes from 5 until 8 in the morning. It's darkness. So we look for things to do, and storytelling was the main thing, and it's something that I think we seriously miss in the modern world, and it's why people are so crazy. Like Ireland was always the place in the world in the modern period with the most cinema screens per person per head. Ireland was way ahead of the rest of the world because people are crazy for stories, and like we're here at 5 o'clock in a Thursday evening, and all you people have come in to hear stories. So we're mad for stories because they tell us something. They tell us about what we are, where we come from, what we need to do. We're telling these ancient stories. Some of them are so ancient that they predate us even almost. And like the Cailleach, which who I'll come to in a moment. But she and the Dagda and these people, they're so old that they don't fit into one storyline. So modern people kind of get a bit frustrated because it doesn't follow on in a linear pattern. It goes here and then you go there and then you go there and then you go there. And that's the way these stories happen.
Yeah, and the characters, that's another thing. Yeah. Just because they have the same name in different stories doesn't mean that they're a character in the modern sense of the word, because they're sort of like archetypes. The really old ones are like archetypes, and they have to represent an awful lot. So you find them behaving in really inconsistent fashion. Yes. And I was saying that in my other world as a writer, if I brought some of these stories to an editor, they'd be like, no, that's not going to work because you've far too many inconsistencies in the character. She behaved this way last week and now she's doing this. And also the stories just keep going off. Yeah. So it's part of our heritage and part of being Irish is the way we tell stories. Yeah. And it is the diversions are part of the story and the inconsistencies are part of the story. So it's quite interesting to get the head around that a bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when you think of people coming together in someone's house night after night, it gave them time to tell a story. You didn't have to rush it. Like I was listening to a storyteller on the radio one day, and he told his story, and there were then the interviewer said, "Oh, that was great, very interesting. Now we've got 8 minutes. Could you tell us a story in 8 minutes?" And the fellow just said no. And he refused to say any more. And I thought, fair play to him. Because otherwise you have to come up with a quick story. And we just didn't tell stories like that. We told them over nights and nights. You know, the Táin is a massive story. It would take the whole winter and you still wouldn't get to the end of it.
Yeah, and this is something we discussed a little bit earlier, but we're going to go into later, that we've been doing the podcast now for a couple of years, and the different mythological cycles have a different kind of energy to them. So like the Cuchulainn stories and the Táin, that's a particular kind of feeling. But Paul was telling a lot of the Fianna stories last year, and I thought these are slightly psychedelic. These are a bunch of lads in a tent in winter, possibly smoking something funny or taking mushrooms. I'm convinced of it, because the story energy is very different. They they keep turning into different things, and then waking up at a different age, and then so there's a kind of a magical realism, surrealism to those stories. Yeah. So I find that quite interesting. Yeah. So we're going to give you one of those stories in a while.
Later on, yes. Yeah.
But before we go into that, maybe tell us a little bit about the really ancient origins of the winter festivals.
Oh yeah, well, everyone has winter festivals. Like in Rome, you had the Saturnalia, and that began on the 17th of December. And Saturn, the god Saturn, a statue of him was carried by thousands of people to the Forum, and there were feasts laid out, and there was just a mass orgy, basically. But everybody wore, like for a week, everybody wore the clothing that befitted a slave. So even the highest people, the senators, everyone, they all wore this clothing. So people mingled together. Masters would serve their servants, would serve food for them. Like the slaves probably cooked the dinner, but the masters would serve them. And they would have these crazy periods for a week, but they'd go mad. They'd dance, they'd sing, they'd do everything. They'd have mock battles in the what do you call it? The amphitheatres. Yeah, thank you. Where they'd have gladiatorial combats, but the gladiators would be women fighting women, or people of short stature fighting a woman, or crazy stuff, an animal with a person. Everybody gave everybody presents. There were little dolls, and everybody got dozens of presents, because it's what you did. You didn't just get one present. You had presents for everyone. So the people who made them made a fortune during that week. And then on the 19th of December was his wife, Ops, who gives us opulent, that term. And she was the goddess of harvest. But at this time of year, she was celebrated because of the grain that was in the stores. So they'd celebrate this plenty that was in the stores. Meanwhile, up in the north, or maybe not meanwhile, but later, or anyway, the Norse people and the Scandinavian people, they had their Yuletide for 12 days. The 12 days of Christmas are from Yuletide, and they had the big log. Now we had a log here as well that was thrown into the fire and set fire. It was usually a piece of pine, not birch, but and they would celebrate the same way. In Ireland, a lot of it was based around the Cailleach. The Cailleach, now I spoke about the Cailleach in Leavis's and in our last thing, so I don't want to talk too much about her here, but she is the oldest of the old. When Fintan MacVochna came here, and he's supposed to be the oldest person in Ireland, she was here before him. She was here before everybody. So she is so old that she's ageless.
And I know we don't want to speak too much about her because the previous episode is about her, but it's kind of central to the whole idea of winter, isn't it, as well? How her progress through her life. So maybe you could say a little bit about how she ages. And
Well, one of her personifications is as winter, and at this time of year she comes to the fore. Now in some stories she is the Cailleach. Cailleach comes from the kailak, which is a cloak, and the women, once they were married, they wore a cloak. So the kailak was a cloaked woman. A colleen was a young person of the cloak, was a girl. Colleen is a girl. So there was the colleen, there was the mother, and then there was the kailak. But at this time of year, she takes the place of Bridget, or is Bridget. Sometimes they say she becomes a rock on St. Bridget's Day, turns into a rock somewhere. But in other stories, she becomes Bridget. And then at the end of the summer, she gets older and older and older, and then she becomes the kailak. So she goes through the land with her cloak and a big staff. And wherever she stamps her staff into the ground, ice and snow appear all around her. Like, for instance, up in Scotland, there's, between Scotland and Rathlin Island, there's a whirlpool there called Curryvracken. And Curra is a whirlpool, and bracken is the plaid, the tweed, the kilt. And she would take her kilt there and wash it for 3 days and 3 nights until it was white. And when she'd take it out, Scotland would be all covered in white, would be covered in snow, basically. So this was her bringing the snow to us. There's a place up there called Glaun Lu. And Lu is another very ancient god. But one day, she and her husband and family came down from the hills. This is in Scotland, but it was all the same culture. So they came down from the hills. They were driven down by bad weather, and they came to this glen. And they asked the people, could they live in the glen? And the people said, okay, yes. And because of that, they looked after the people. They looked after their livestock. They looked after their crops. And everybody flourished. And they were there to guard them, to look after them, but they were, come in. Hi, come on in. They were there, but anyway, they were there from time immemorial. And then the land clearances came, the highland clearances came, and the people were moved out of the valley, and it fell into abeyance. And in 2011, a group of people went up and they found the old fallen down Bohan, and they rebuilt it and rethatched it. And they found in the house there were river-worn stones. When they left the valley, and they said, but if you look after our house and these facsimiles of us, the river-worn stones, we'll continue to look after the valley. So the people did that until they all left. And then in 2011, a group of people went up and they found them and they put them out, and they take them out on the 1st of February, St. Bridget's Day, and they put them in for Samhain. So they're indoors for the winter. So that has been going, with a break, it's been going on for time immemorial.
It could be thousands of years.
Yeah, it could.
And I think this is really interesting and kind of a moment maybe to pause and reflect, because when the kailak comes into this story, you start to realise it's the way of trying to personify the land,
yes,
and the weather and the systems. And I love this idea of Vreed becoming the kailak, becoming Vreed, becoming the kailak.
Yeah.
So it's like they're not two separate things. They're contained within each other. They're different forms of the same being, which in some ways must be the earth.
Yeah.
And then the relationship between the people and the earth is the earth will protect and nourish as long as you honour.
Yes.
As long as you can do the honouring that's required back.
And in those days, and for long, right up to the 16th century, the kings, to be a king of Ireland, you had to marry the kailak. You married the land. You married a land goddess, who in many cases is the kailak. And there's a story of Niall of the Nine Hostages and his 3 brothers. Their father died. And they were kind of rowing to see who'd be High King. And they were out hunting one day, and it was very hot. That one day, it was very hot, and they got really thirsty, and they found a well, but it was guarded by a kailak. A kailak or the kailak, she's all one really. And they went up, one by one, they went up, starting with the eldest brother, who asked, could he have some water? And she said, I will if you give me a kiss. And she was hideous. And he said, no way. So he went away thirsty, and the second brother went up, and the third brother went up, and she asked, and they said no. And Niall went up, and she said, if you give me a kiss, and he took her in his arms and embraced her, and she became young, and he married the goddess because she became the goddess. So he married the queen, the land, and became king.
And this idea of rejuvenation and the cycle of it.
Yeah.
But I love it that he has to love her in her old form first
Yes,
before she presents her other form, her maybe more typically attractive form. Yeah, he has to be brave enough.
Yeah. Well, I just want to point out as well, Cailleach gets translated as hag. It's not, that's an incorrect translation. The Cailleach is just an older person. She's not a hag. She's not ugly. She's not a witch with warts and a big nose and all this. She's just an older, mature woman.
But in this story, she is a bit of...
Well, in this story, she's pretty hideous, all right.
She's not a looker. Okay, which is, I suppose, part of how the best simple stories work is by exaggerating everything.
Yes.
You know, you need this kind of exaggeration for emphasis. And then you've got these characters that aren't quite characters. Yeah. Do you know what I think we should do is we should talk about the next part of that and then go to the audience, which is the bit about the Bog Bodies, which I've sort of been saying for ages, Paul, we should do a podcast about the Bog Bodies. And he said, well, there aren't stories as such about Bog Bodies, but it fits really interestingly into some of this idea of land as spouse or land as what does the land want from the people. So you tell me what you're
well, there's an archaeologist, he's probably retired now, but Ned Kelly his name is, and he's done a huge amount of study of the Bog Bodies, and they occur all across Ireland, very commonly in Ireland, but they're across Britain and right across Northern Europe. Well, Northern Europe, southern Denmark, northern Germany, Holland, across there, anywhere bogs are basically. But it seems that people were, the Bog Bodies are people who were buried in a liminal area. So there were places between kingdoms. So that it was liminal in that sense, but it was also a place between this world and the other world, not the underworld because we didn't have an underworld, but the other world. So the bog is a perfect place for the perfect example. What do you call it? Simile for the other world because you get sucked in and you're gone, and then thousands of years later you're still there. You're perfectly formed except you're a bit leathery looking.
I wonder, did they know that when they were burying the Bog Bodies?
Well, you got pretty leathery and your hair went red very quickly within weeks of it.
But could they have known that like 2,000 years later we'd be digging up bodies that had been preserved? Because maybe they were finding something from 2,000 years previously.
Well, that's interesting because they always thought, until recently, we thought they were from Iron Age times. So from 500 BC up till Christian times, up to 500 BC to 500 AD, give or take. But lately, as dating methods have improved, dating the bodies they found some from Bronze Age times, 3,500 years ago, and from much more modern times. I don't mean modern, they found modern ones, but they just fell in, but more modern. Like there was a German fella was found, he had coins in his pocket from 72 was the latest coin. So I don't know whether he fell foul of someone or he fell. And a lot of people were disappeared in bogs as well.
But the Bog Bodies, in the classical sense, the ones who seem to have been ritually placed in the bog, have certain characteristics.
Yes, they were always from good family. They were well nourished and they were usually very tall. Well, of course, people were tall. We got smaller. So we kind of think of us getting taller and taller through time. But in Bronze Age times, people were 6'6", 6'5", regularly, and then during Iron Age, they got smaller, and there were ups and downs. But anyway, I digress.
You digress.
I digress.
But they were from good families.
They were from good families,
good accents.
and they could tell because they're so perfectly preserved. They have their fingerprints, so then they can see their hands were clean. Their fingernails were well tended. They didn't have a lot of welts that would come with working the land very hard. They were well fed. Their bone structure was good. Their teeth were good. Because when you think of it, if you're going to try and propitiate a god, you're not going to throw any old scrag into it. You want to give someone good. Yeah.
Any suitable candidates here?
Yeah. The place is full of suitable candidates.
And they had their hair all done, didn't they? They were kind of...
Well, there was one fellow who was found fairly recently, and he was small. He was only 5'8" 8 or something like that, or 6. So he was very small, and he felt the lack of inches. So he was found wearing high heel shoes, like about 4 inches tall, platforms basically, and he also had his hair done up in a very elaborate top knot, very high, and it was kept up, they discovered, by a resin that at that time was found in a tree that only grew in northern Spain. So hair gel was totally Bronze Age.
But this had been brought from northern Spain halfway across Europe as a cosmetic.
As a cosmetic for him, yeah. Well, for the likes of him, yeah.
So just to sort of tie it together, your sense of this is that these are the bridegrooms.
Yes.
So these are the sacrificial bridegrooms being given to the earth /Kyloch /reed, or some earlier version of same.
Yes.
Yeah, so the earth is requiring a sacrifice. Yeah. But we don't know, but we think.
Well, yeah, we think so, and it seems pretty likely. Like, they used to say that it was an honour. I always thought, I was always a bit sceptic about that one, but they found out that it wasn't, because usually their heads are bashed in. So someone came up behind them and bopped them on the head. Quite often their forearms are covered in cuts, and as they fend off the blows, because they didn't want to go quietly into this good night. And so they were attacked and then bashed. And then their throats were slit. And then a noose was made of hair or grasses or something that wouldn't work as a noose but looks beautiful, and that would be put around their necks, and then they'd be placed in the bog. They always had the last same meal, which was oatmeal and buttermilk, and because it's still in their stomachs, and they can tell what time of year they're buried because they go through the nostrils and they find the grains of pollen, and they can tell, pollen grains are like fingerprints. Every different plant has different grain, and they separate them out in a dilute acidic solution, and they can infer what time of year it was, if there was more pine or more flowers or something. So they know exactly they now know what, all the later ones, they know exactly when they were killed. And then they were put into a pool of the bog, and they were pegged down, sometimes through their wrists, like they were dead at this stage, but they were through their wrists and ankles, and sometimes sides, and they were pegged down to hold them in the bog, and then gradually the bog grew over them, like the water flowed over them, and then the bog formed over them.
It's quite grim, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I mean, sometimes I glorify the past, and I'm thinking, what's the psyche that decides to do that? It's an interesting, and as you say, not for a short period of time in some random distant past of a small group of people, fairly consistently across Northern Europe for a few thousand years.
Yeah.
Wow. I think this is a good moment to go to the audience. I'm going to unmute that microphone, and if anybody would like to either ask a question or reflect on what we've been talking about, just sort of shout in the direction of that.
I mean, how do we know, for example, that the kind of well-nourished upper-class guy who was buried there wasn't killed by the other tribe, and then they gave him a burial? Because there must be some kind of gap in tradition, things we don't know.
Yeah, of course.
Right, which were not traded over to the next generation or the next whatever.
Yeah.
And then Christianity came and it was all gone.
Yeah.
So how do we know?
So they're usually fairly accurate in their inferences, in how they work it out. And I suppose it's the way that they're all killed right across Europe. They're all killed in liminal areas. So it just seems like that's the right way, not that they were just killed in a battle or killed somewhere else. It just seems that that's the way it worked.
I mean, I was wondering the same thing, actually, but then I thought the way they're pinned down, that's very specific, isn't it? To take them to the bog and then pin them down in the same way across all these territories. Yeah, I don't know. We have a time machine.
So we don't really know.
Because he said it was a sacrifice.
Yeah.
From what I hear, I could always also assume, hey, these guys did something awful, and they were killed as a kind of death penalty.
Yeah, but then you'd get a whole...
They were stuffed into the bog.
But then you'd get a range of different people in the bog. You'd get all kinds of person rather than tall, well-fed, well-groomed.
And all with the head bashed in, or...
Yeah, usually death by a blunt instrument on the back of the head. Yeah, and then the throat slit and the noose.
You did say to me, actually, when we were talking about this before, that these could be the failed kings.
Yeah,
I don't think you said that today.
That's the other theory, that these were the people, that these men, because they're mostly men, that they were the people who had married the land and had failed. They'd lost a battle, there was a crop shortage, there was a plague ran through, something or other, or maybe their time was just up, and there's a possibility that they were sacrificed then, and the new king, as part of the ceremony, was married to the land.
Because the contract appears to have been in this banishry, or the marriage of the king to the land, is that if the king was a good spouse to the land, a good husband and lover, I like to think, to the land, then the tribe would prosper, the clan would prosper. And if the king was not a good king, then the crops would fail, and they'd lose territory, and people would be sick. So that's kind of the vibe behind that yes, this might be what happens to the kings who don't do a good job as king, or at least have the misfortune to have plague rampage through their population while they happen to be king. Yeah.
Thank you. And it's not really a question, but more sort of like a weaving of threads. It's just interesting that they threw them in the bog, because if the bog's like a liminal space, it's less about, I'm thinking like the bodies being decomposted and going back into the earth. Like, I wonder if they knew this kind of like, it's a liminal space, they didn't do their job right. Now they put in this kind of other world, between worlds. It's curious that they chose that rather than let's just put them in a hole in the ground. Because then that would be a different kind of process.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like the Catholic concept of limbo, which is a horrible one. But
it'd be like the worst kind of torture in a way.
Yeah. You're neither there nor there, you're caught in between. So maybe that's the worst possible punishment. I mean, what's fun about this in a way is that we can take all the expertise of the archaeologists and the storytellers, but we can still wonder and question, because without a time machine.
And actually there's an archaeologist up in Mayo, Michael, what's his name? Michael... anyway, I'll think of it in a minute. But he's a leading archaeologist, and he has found more sites than anybody else. And it's because he embraces the mythology. And he looks and he sees, this was where the King of France's gold was hidden. And they used to say, it's much older than that, it's ridiculous. And he would say, but why is it called that? The local people came up with a story about it 400 years ago, because there was something there, and he'd go back and back and back. And he's discovered all kinds of places. Because he's embraced both. He's got both of them.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, finding your way into a landscape and into the past through story.
Yeah.
Because the stories have lived, and they've changed, but they've lived. Karen, you have a question?
Do you want to keep going, or will I say? One thing I really like is the reference to cloak, because when I was doing my research on the women 100 years ago, the cloak was still really important. Yes. And you have that cloak that becomes the West Cork cloak, or Clonakilty if you're from Clon, or Bandon, or Kinsale, or wherever. And that was a dowry, a piece of dowry that women got, that they made, and it was given as a dowry. It was part of your dowry when you got married, and this was used as a winter blanket, it covered also everything. And they were used in Clonakilty up to the mid-70s, that women would put them on because it covered a multitude. But just that sense of the Kylach and the cloak, and of course we have it with Bridget and that, I think that's amazing that tie is still there as well, as an object.
The idea of sacrifice is interesting. I was watching a program on the Discovery Channel a couple of nights ago from the States. So I wouldn't take too much notice of some of those programs, but what they were trying to show was that there had been migration from Ireland, maybe earlier than we think, to the eastern sides of the States. And among other things, they were showing some druidic things like blood. They had this idea that there was a bloodstone, and they were showing it, and there was channels in it. So I was just thinking there, if you give a fella a good bang on the head with a stone, you probably don't need to cut their throat,
No, you don't need to. No.
But we don't know, if there was sacrifice, we don't know Would there do anything with blood? If we could find in Ireland lots of these stone tables where maybe they'd be channeling blood,
Yes.
and maybe doing something with it. But the other interesting thing, then, of course, is that soon after that, you had obviously the Bronze Age, and then moving on eventually to Christian times, which you mentioned there, around in Ireland anyway, the fourth or fifth century, I suppose. But the basis of Christianity is also based on sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Messiah,
Yes.
and the shedding of blood there. And I presume that's the idea that they had, was that, the Son of God is coming and he's sacrificing himself. And therefore, look, the difference between Christianity then and what they would call paganism then would be, well, this person here has sacrificed himself, and there's no need for any more sacrifice. So where did that idea come from? Presumably because, we were often told that the Druids did, there was sacrifice involved, but we probably never proved that. But it's just interesting that there was further moves to eliminate, with Christianity at least, maybe other religions, to eliminate that thing.
Yeah.
So perhaps it was there,
Yeah. And they say that that's one of the reasons that Christianity took hold so quickly, because it was a sacrifice without sacrifice, if you like, because it was just Jesus was sacrificed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the Eucharist specifically is that the bread is instead of a blood sacrifice.
Person,
yeah. But I think the sort of philosophical link here, if I can, is the uncertainty of life. You think about all the different ways in which human beings for the last couple of 100,000 years try to control the world around them that is uncontrollable. And this idea of a sacrifice is that, well, if we do this, the gods will be happy. Yeah. And we can, we'll get good weather if we slit the throat of a goat on the top of a mountain. Or you see it in all the old mythologies, and you see it in a lot of indigenous spiritualities, this idea that you have to make the gods happy.
Yeah.
And what you're trying to do is live in a world full of uncertainty. And what you're trying to do in Ireland 3,000 years ago is deal with the fact that the sun is going to get so low in the sky and you're going to get so cold and kind of a little bit hopeless. That you need to believe that you're keeping the gods happy, that you need to do something to ensure that the sun is going to come back. Yeah. I mean, and that's sort of how I think it must have been, which leads us nicely to Newgrange. It does, yeah. Because I know people know about Newgrange, but there's just a bit more to talk about.
Not just Newgrange, but most of these passage tombs, they're aligned to the setting sun or the rising sun at midwinter, midsummer, or the other times of years. What do you call the
equinox?
The equinoxes. But Newgrange is one, and there's a 9-inch hole over the door, and the rising sun on a clear day, the rising sun coming up for 3 days, it happens actually. It comes over the hill at dawn and it shines through the hole over the door, and the light moves down the long passageway to a little cruciform chamber, and it lights it all up. But the story that they gave for that was that the Dagda, who was kind of a sun god in a way, and he was riding his chariot across the sky from east to west. It would rise and then he'd set in the west. And he looked down and he saw this beautiful woman who was Boine, who was a land goddess. She was a river goddess, but she was of the land. He was kind of the air, a god. And he wanted her. But the fly in the ointment was that she was married. So he stopped his chariot, which stopped time. And for one day, he courted her, won her, bedded her, impregnated her. She went through full term and the baby was born. And then
what a guy.
It was back to normal. And then her husband said, "You what? Where? I was only able to prepare me back for 1 minute." Just
went to the shop to buy some milk, and look what happened.
Their son then was Angus Og. And Angus means the one desire, because that was his one desire, was for Boine. And he is the god, the Celtic god of love, the Irish god of love. And he just wanders through the world dressed in kind of nothing, but he's decently covered in greenery and flowers and things, and birds fly around his head, and each bird is a kiss. And he just, everyone loves him. Men love him, women love him, everyone adores him. And he's their son. Now, he cropped up in other stories in slightly different form, but this is the basic thing. But the idea of Newgrange then is that the sun god penetrates the earth god, the Boyne, Bruna Boyne, at the hostel of the Boyne, and the shaft penetrates right into the centre, into the womb, if you like, of the hill. And there's several of them like that. There's Technicaili, the Kaila's house in Lough Crew, which is another centre of these. There's about 30 of them there in west of County Meath, and on the 21st of December, the light shines straight through there as well in that one.
And it's interesting that you're talking about Boine and the river goddess, but then the next example is Technicaili, so we're back to the Cailleach. So it's this personification of the land as being rejuvenated by the sun at its lowest ebb.
Yeah, yeah.
And sort of that sows the seeds then of spring, which starts to come.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Cailleach can become Rita again.
Because once the 17th of December happens, the sun starts to come back. It's not. 21st. No, it's not actually the 21st. It's about around the 17th. The days start to get imperceptibly longer, and it turns around. So we're nearly there. Just a few more days, folks. But it starts to come back, and and gradually it unfolds and grows, and things start to appear. And
I just go to you guys now for some reflections on that. But Newgrange is older than the pyramids at Giza and Stonehenge. This is really ancient stuff, and it's in our landscape. And the fact that we have stories that are in some way, that we've had a parallel tradition of story and architecture that has lasted that long, is kind of extraordinary. Yeah. That we have the hostel of the Boyne in that story that wasn't imposed separately, because they've forgotten about the actual physical Newgrange when these stories were being written down by monks. So it's it's quite fascinating that the stories have lived on in the consciousness while the stones have lived on in the landscape. Yeah. Anybody have anything to say about that part of it, the light coming back and those things? I have a question. Do you think it's because they were farmers?
Which?
These people who built Newgrange. Do you think that this understanding of the cycle of light was linked to crops?
Sure. I'm sure it was, yeah. And I'm sure they didn't need Newgrange as a calendar. I'm sure they knew instinctively, the way we all know when it's darkest or when all this. But it was to mark it. It was to have a ceremony, to have a formal recognition that this was the midwinter, the end of it, the shortest day or the longest day or whatever. I'm sure that was it. But it takes some ability, like to line up a thing as big as that with the setting or the rising sun at any time of year, or the moon or stars or whatever.
I'm glad you took that moment to reflect on it, because it is very profound that it hasn't changed in all those thousands and thousands of years. Because we hear these things like pole shifts and all this kind of change happening. But they said, there's a saying, there's three things that, you can't hide: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Three things. And coming in tonight, it was magnificent. The moon is in Gemini, and we have a full moon, and it's just a magnificently beautiful full moon. And I guess that would have been part of winter, that the sun, the moon being in Gemini, and the moon goes through cycles and the sun goes through cycles. And these are just everlasting. And it's like our annual cycle is part of the Kali Yuga, which is 22,000 years old cycle. Yeah. So there's, it's such a joy that we're walking on hallowed ground. And the reverence. I know it was life and death, but it's a reverence that I feel is has disappeared. Well, not disappeared, but we became disconnected from it, put it like that. I'm involved with the cleaning of wells and finding holy wells and waters. And it's just keeps opening up. There's so many of them and they got covered over. But people in the area, eventually you find little stories.
And it's almost like the stories sometimes are waiting just for people to listen or something. I don't know. I have a kind of a not entirely rational feeling about it, that they're there if we can listen and if we can look.
If we can go still. There's a lovely story by Caroline Hiller, and she speaks about how stones hold stories. And they are the kind of, as you walk past them, they're kind of taking in that kind of lived memory or that lived experience or that lived story, and they're just waiting for people to pick them up and listen to them.
Yeah.
And I just love that idea, because it's like the stories of Ireland are so entrenched and rooted in the land. We just need to kind of remember.
Yeah, and that connects also with the Cailleach, because in many of the stories, when it comes to spring, she turns into a rock somewhere. But that rock is revered in the area as the Cailleach, like the one in the Beara. And they're all over the country and all over Scotland and Isle of Man and everywhere.
Yeah, that's lovely. That's a lovely reflection. They're both really lovely reflections. Thank you. And I think it all comes back to this feeling of the person as being part of a living ecosystem, as opposed to the person being separate to or above the living ecosystem. And this is something that I think is coming up for a lot of us at the moment, trying to find a place in the world and trying to look at all that's happening in the world, to the ecosystem of the world. And it wasn't done before. Now, partly they didn't have the technology, but they didn't have that separate us and the rocks, us and the rivers, us. It seemed to be much more that we were all part of the same story, in fact, and we were all characters in the same story, as opposed to this, there's people and then there's the environment in capital letters. Yeah. And maybe that's part of the value of going back into the old stories.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that happens with Christianity, with the arrival of Christianity, because it's very much dualistic. There are two worlds. Whereas before that, and even with Christianity in Ireland, we held on to it. But before Christianity in Ireland, God was everywhere. And in early Christian times, God was still in everything. So God was in the rock and in the tree and in the bush and in the bird and in everything. And I think we've really kept that. There's a very thin layer of Christianity over our paganism. Our paganism is this welling, and the Christianity is just a little coating, I think.
Yeah.
I think,
maybe.
Isn't that a bit too like the Christianity that came from Ireland versus the Christianity that came from Rome, and the clash that that we were definitely more animistic or whatever.
Yeah, we were, and that animistic kind of church lasted up until the 11th century, 10th century anyway, when Rome began to form, and the last Culmon from Inishbofin, who ended up going to Inishbofin. He was the abbot of Lindisfarne, Holy Island, in the east of England. And he used to walk around in his bare feet and robes, leading a goat, because when he was hungry, he'd milk the goat and drink the milk. And St. Cuthbert was brought in after this big council. And the council was on a couple of things. One of them was reckoning the date of Easter. Ireland did it the old-fashioned way, and Ireland had huge influence because people had left Ireland and educated and founded monasteries right down as far as Bobbio, as you'll see here in this exhibition. But so Ireland had a huge influence, but Rome began to form, and it formed itself in the old Roman legion way. So the Pope was the emperor, and then the cardinals. You didn't have to be a priest to be a cardinal up until the Middle Ages. The cardinals, then the archbishops, then the bishops, and all the way down. And we were at the bottom, the ordinary people, and they began to. So Cuthbert came in as the first English saint of Lindisfarne, and he was carried in by 4 men on a chair. Not because he was incapable of walking, but because he was now holier than thou.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you start giving individuals like that power, what happens to the systems around?
Yeah.
Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
So he had to be carried in, and so ushered in a new era of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, and it is interesting that throughout every myth we talk about and every piece of folklore, there's this bit of Christianity, because a lot of the stories we talk about were written down by monks in these beautiful illuminated manuscripts that are works of art in themselves. Yeah. But the people who are paying for the books were the church. So I always have this kind of suspicion of the story and the narrative in these books, because they're being paid for by one part of the system. Yes. And they're kind of taking bits of the pagan stories that they want. And a bit like, as you were saying, with the Cailleach in Vera being turned into a stone by the
Cathagurn.
By Cathagurn. Yeah. That was the triumph of Christianity over the pagans.
Yes, yeah.
And of course, who writes the stories but the victors? So they wrote that story that way, but we get to maybe retell them slightly now.
We do, yeah.
Yeah, and Cailleach has hopefully outlived Cathagurn.
Yes.
In our consciousness,
she
anyway.
Has,
yeah, because we know of her and we don't know. Well, I don't know much about. It was a nun, was it?
It was a female saint. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cathagurn,
okay.
Yeah. Well, a saint. Like many of these, they weren't really saints, they were just called saint.
Well, it's who tells the stories.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and who gets to tell the characters. Yeah. Does anybody else want to say anything from the audience there?
I grew up in Australia and first came to Ireland in my 50s or 60s or something. And I felt all my life that I was missing exactly what you're talking about. And I'm not quite sure whether it's in our DNA or how we got that. I came from a large family and nobody else felt like that. It's just a comment that all this stuff that you're talking about is stuff that I've waited for all my life. And now I only get a little tiny, I'll have to be 300 before I got hold of some of the stuff that you're talking about. But it's such a delight to have actually come along and hear all this when I see these things on the walls and how life has finally, for me, even though, I have Irish ancestry, well and truly, with a name like Fitzgerald, and my mother was an O'Brien. But yeah, for me, it's like this is what I've always wanted. And I guess in my childhood, I didn't even know that was what I wanted, but I knew something was missing. And now I have it, and it's lovely.
Yeah. Well, you're Céad Míle fáilte, so that's 1,000 times welcome.
Thank you.
But it is really lovely what you say, Loretta, and I think that even for those of us who have lived here all our lives, sort of in theory, with access to these traditions, there has been this process of trying to find it, because it has been obscured. Yeah. So I grew up my whole life here, but I didn't really get this growing up. There are a lot of layers in the way. Catholicism largely, but then urbanisation and poverty is a terrible thing that gets in the way of people's tradition and indigenous connection to the land, because I think there's nothing as fragmenting as having had a population that have had to go around the world away from their place because they couldn't keep body and soul together in their own landscape. So whatever O'Briens and Fitzgeralds left to go to Australia, they probably didn't do it for a holiday. They probably did it because they needed to go and do something better somewhere else. So I think there's a lot of us feeling that there is that break, and there is a bit of a trauma there by not being able to be here in relationship with our Indigenous landscape. Yeah. So some part of this podcast is a little bit about trying to heal some of that, just to remember it, to bring it back for us all. Because I'll just say, when I was in Australia, I was there for a year and I felt really disconnected from something that I knew I had in Ireland.
Aboriginal people in Australia have a connection to the land that is absolutely beautiful and magic, but people like me didn't have. So where we lived was, you moved around for all sorts of reasons, but you didn't own, like in Australian Aboriginal culture, the land owns you. You don't own the land, which is really beautiful. But we never actually had any real connection to the land. And it's just fascinating to see it in this new way, where we're all connected to the land, and to see it explored and celebrated here is just for me is magic, because certainly Aboriginal people have their culture connected, but they didn't share it with us because there's Aboriginal men's business and women's business, and it wasn't part of me ever. So I didn't get it. And I always even looked at Aboriginal people and their connection with land and their connection with country and their languages and all of those things. But we didn't get it.
Yes.
And to finally actually have hold of it's just lovely.
I'll ask you a slight diversion and then we'll go to the Fionn McCool story and let everyone go home. But just on that, it's worth exploring. We've talked before about this idea of ownership. You know, it's such a crazy notion and relatively recent that one individual might own 15,000 acres in Munster, for example, like the Earl Spencer in the plantations, that you'd give all this land to one person who has their name on a deed is quite a new and crazy notion. Yeah. And no Indigenous group has that concept of ownership. But we talked before about the Tuatha and the clan and the relationship of the clan to the land. Yes. Yeah. You might just say a little bit about that.
Well, the clans were spread all over the country. And it didn't really change. The population didn't really change for many, many hundreds of years, right up into recent times. Obviously not modern times, but recent times. So there was people lived in a dune, say, a circular enclosure from Iron Age times, and your family lived in that, and you'd have maybe three or four brothers, sister, and their families. So you'd have your clan there. That was your clan, your family, and you farmed that area and you looked after it, and you had neighbours all around who were a few miles away, and if you had a whole lot of sons, that meant you had a warrior group. So your warrior elite was big. So you would then take over your neighbours. We were talking about this in the class today. You would take over your neighbours and your neighbours' neighbours, and gradually you would put your but your kingship over the area, and then gradually that would get bigger and bigger, and you could be the king of Munster, say, or rarely you could be the High King of Ireland. Now the High King of Ireland didn't really mean the High King of Ireland, except Brian Boru travelled 3 times around Ireland at 3 different times to ensure that he was recognised as the king. And as soon as he'd come, people would bow the knee. They would actually, when in Ireland, when you bowed to a superior lord, you sucked at his nipple, which is pretty demeaning, really, isn't it?
Well, it depends.
Well, I don't know. I think it's pretty.
Okay.
Maybe it isn't.
I don't know if demeaning's the word. It's a bit. It's quite odd.
Yeah, it is. But it's really putting you down. I think that you're suckling at his nipple because you're feeding off him because he's the big thing. But anyway, he went 3 times. In 3 different times, he went around the country, and people would just come when he'd turn up with his warrior. You know, a navy came and his army came. So people would just bow before him and say, "Yeah, you're the king. You're the man. You're the man." And he would move on. And then as soon as he was gone, they'd revert to normal type. But every year they'd send crops or cattle or whatever to him. So that was the way the kingdoms worked, and it was an ever changing system of alliances, moving back and forth until really in the 16th century. Well, it became stratified then because of Cromwell coming in the 17th century. But the main chieftains were like the Fitzgeralds. They were there, and all the different, the O'Briens. God, you were well connected, weren't you? Yeah. The O'Briens and Thomond and so, and they were kings of their area, the O'Neills and the O'Donnells and all of these. They were the kings of their area, of their greater areas, which meant that they could call these subordinates to battle. They could rely on them for crops, for cattle or whatever. So they were able to rely on them, basically.
So it was kind of territory rather than ownership.
It wasn't ownership at all. It was territory. Yeah. And it was just the power to hold that territory. And you would go out and raid, but then you'd go home to your own place. And it wasn't really your place. It was where your clan was from.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in there that I went to the Butter Museum in Cork last week for the second time in the space of about 6 weeks because it's very interesting. So the Butter Museum in Cork is in honour of all the butter that was distributed around the world as far as the Caribbean from Cork Port. But there's a bit upstairs that I took a picture of to show Paul about cattle raiding. And basically, in order to prove your strengths and your prowess, you went cattle raiding. So is it their equivalent of hurling or rugby is what I decided it was. And people would get injured and occasionally a bit killed. but it wasn't all out warfare. It was, we take our lads and we go and fight your lads. And if you didn't go and steal some cattle, you were just kind of a nothing. You had to prove your power by going to steal cattle. But it was like this kind of game, and a territorial game, rather than anything like, say, World War One, which was a killing machine. Yeah. You know, it's a very different type of warfare.
And it was a game, because part of it even was that the young fellow would gallop up on his horse or his chariot, and he would touch a rival of the opposite side with his spear. Just touch him. He wouldn't kill him. He'd just touch him and say, "Gotcha," and then gallop away.
So it's like kick the can or something. Yeah. So anyway, this all plays into the fact that the psyche was very different, and the idea of ownership and the idea of territory was very different to how it is now. And it's hard for us to get back to it. But, they weren't saints. They seem to have been doing blood sacrifices, sucking each other's nipples in public. And stealing.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that in public. I just say one thing about the Kylach thing, and this is just my own response to what you were saying, is that I can almost imagine it on two levels, where the lads are all stealing cattle, no offence, gentlemen, but there's this happening at a sort of territorial level, a little bit like, the Six Nations is happening in the spring, and I'll be very interested in that. But maybe the Kylach stuff is happening at another level, which is, it doesn't really matter who, as long as the landscape is being honoured. Yes. And as long as the cycle of the seasons is being related to, then all of this other stuff can go in and out. Doesn't matter if it's...
And the Kylach also, as we saw in our last podcast, she always wanted to keep things balanced between the male and the female side of things. And she actively acted to make... there's one story where a man wants to walk, and he does his walk, and there's a big story about how he walks, and he's exhausted and he's going to die because he's walked too far. And she says to him, she takes pity on him and says, "Look, do you have a wife? Does she make butter? Do you have butter at home?" So she does. So he says, "Go in and get her to open a tub of butter, a firkin of butter, and put your feet in it and lie by the fire. And when he wakes up in the morning, he has sucked the entire firkin of butter through the soles of his feet." And that was because he was such a man that he needed to be balanced by the feminine side. The butter making, it was the feminine job. So it was that holistic approach.
Yeah, that's a lovely interpretation of that. Yeah. So can you tell us a story in 8 minutes?
I'll tell it in 7.5. This is about the Céitach. It's from the Fianna. And the Fianna were of course led by Fionn McCool, and they were outdoors. This time of year they probably stayed in tents and in their dunes, taking mushrooms and smoking things, but telling stories. But this is a story of the Céitach, or the lad of the skins. And one day Fionn and the Fianna, they're out on the hill and they've been hunting, and they see someone coming away in the distance, and he gets closer and closer, and he's a big burly fella, and he's dressed all in skins, animal skins. And he comes up and they say, "How are you?" And he says, "I'm grand, how are you?" "You're Fionn, I've come for a job. I want to serve you." So Fionn says, "Well, okay." And Connell, who is one of the rival clan in the Fianna, who was always very negative, says, "Oh no, don't take him. We don't know who his people are. We don't know who he is. Nothing good is going to come from this." And Fionn says, "Shh." So he takes him in, and he works for him. And early on in his service, the Fianna are going out hunting. So the lad of the skins says, "Can I go hunting with you tomorrow?" And Fionn says, "Yeah, of course you can." He said, "Well, will you all go one way and I'll go another way? And then we'll compare our catch at the end of the day." So Fionn says, "Yeah, okay. Do you want the high, dry, good land, or do you want the low, boggy, terrible land?" And he said, "I'll take the low, boggy, terrible land, awful land that you fall into and die, and there's no animals or anything. So I'll take that." So he heads off, and at the end of the day, he has caught more than the rest of the Fianna put together. So Fionn knows this is a good man. But Connell isn't happy. And Connell is he worries at things, and he keeps goading at people, and he keeps saying things and keeps at him, and he's at Fionn, and he's saying, nothing good's going to come from this. He's going to cause division. He's going to cause terrible things. Get rid of him. And Fionn says, well, I can't. I've signed him up. We've made our arrangement. We've agreed on fee and everything. So I can't get rid of him. And he says, well, you don't have to sack him. Just send him on an impossible task or a big task. So Fionn says, like what? And he said, well, the king of the floods has a horn of plenty. It's a food cuisine attachment that produces enough food for whoever wants it. So it's a bottomless pit of food, and it's called the horn of plenty. He's got that, and you could do with it. So Fionn says, that's true. So send him off on that. So he says, right. So the next morning he calls the Cathach to him and he says, I want you to find the king of the floods and get his horn of plenty. So the Cathach says, fair enough, I'm your servant, I have to do as you ask. So he goes down to the beach and he picks up 2 stones and he puts them in a cruciform shape and he lets go and it turns into a little boat. And he gets into the boat and the boat sails off, and all he hears are the whistling of eels and the singing of seabirds. It says in the story. I think that's really beautiful. The whistling of eels and the singing of seabirds. That's all he can hear. And eventually the boat finds its way to the land of the King of the Floods. And his dune is so full of people visiting, because he's the Horn of Plenty, I suppose. But there's so many people there that there's over 100 boats tied up going way out to sea. So the Cathach can't even get in to land his boat. So he just ties it up at the furthest boat and he hops across and hops across and hops across, and he makes his way to the city, to the dune where the King of the Floods is having a big feast. And the Horn of Plenty looks in, and the Horn of Plenty has been passed around, and there's the people everywhere. And he's there for quite a while. And finally he says in a loud, pointed voice, you have great manners here, great welcoming for strangers, that you wouldn't even be given a drop of drink or a bit of food. And the king hears this and says, oh God, he's right. Here, get this man, pass the corn to him, the Horn of Plenty, the corn it's called. So he gets it, and as soon as he gets it, he bolts for his boat, and he races over all the boats all the way down, and he gets there and he thinks, this isn't the way to do it. I'll go back and fight them. So he goes all the way back, over them all, vaulting all the way back, and he gets back, and meanwhile they've pulled themselves together and they've got their guns, their swords and their spears and everything, and he goes through them and over them and under them until there's no more sound. So he knocks them all out, and then he walks back over all the boats and he sails back home to Ireland, and he presents it to Fionn, and Fionn says, fair play to you, well done, I didn't know you'd even find him. So it's fine. Fionn has the corn now, the Horn of Plenty, and the men are all eating out of it. And days go by, weeks go by, and Fionn is washing in the well one morning, and the well speaks to him and says, you're going to have to either give the King of Floods back his Horn of Plenty or fight him properly for it. So you have to go back. So Fionn says, okay, because he can nod as good as a wink to him. The well has spoken, so he's going to go back. So he calls the Cathach to him and he says, we've got to go back. The well has told me we have to go back and fight him. And the Cathach says, well, that's fine, except my term of service is up. It's up now. It's up this evening. It's the last night of it. So I can't go because I'm finished my term of service with you. And Fionn says, oh no, that's terrible. I really need you. So he says, well, if you need me, there's a way around it. My wife, who's a daughter of Manannán Mac Lir, she combs her hair in the middle of the night. And anyone who's watching her comb her hair can ask her any favour and she has to grant it. So Fionn says, oh, good. So he hides in the cupboard or something, the wardrobe, and he waits for them to fall asleep, and then she gets up in the night and she's combing her long black hair, and he comes out and says, I want to ask you something. And she says, well, you know the story, I have to give it to you. He says, I want your man to come with me. So she says, all right then, let him go. So they go down to the beach again, and she said, oh, but I want him back dead or alive, whatever way he is. And he said, no, it'll be grand. And he said, well, I want him back dead or alive. So when you come home, if he's dead, raise a red flag. If he's alive, raise a gloss flag, a grey-green flag. So just hoist it, and I'll know before the boat lands. So they head off. Next morning they head off. They go down to the beach. The Cathach picks up 2 stones or 2 sticks, crosses them, and a boat appears, and they get into it, and they sail off, and they get to the Catholics' land. Now, there's no one there at this stage because he doesn't have the Horn of Plenty. So they go sail right up, and they announce what they're going to do. So the army comes out, and the Catholic goes through them and over them and under them until there's not a sound, and they're all unconscious. He's a bit like Asterix and Obelix.
Can you say that as well? Yeah, through them and over them and under them.
Tríd agus haar agus fuan. So through them and over them and under them. So and then they go in. He and Fionn go in to the king, who's hiding in his dune, and Fionn challenges him and beats him. So he says, "I'm taking your Horn of Plenty. I'm announcing it to you." So he takes it and brings it back, and they're heading back in their boat back to Ireland. And Fionn is delighted with himself, and he's got his extra bit of service from the Catholic. The Catholic is happy enough, and then they see off in the distance a speck, way off, not from where they came from, but off to the west or the east or somewhere. And they look at it, and Catholic says, "It's a boat. It's a boat coming." And I told you to use quiet knitting needles. And the Catholic says, "It's someone coming for me. I know it is. I have a bad feeling about it." And it gets closer and closer. It's going so fast that it's catching up with them, even though they're heading that way, and it's coming sideways to them. And it's getting close. He says, "Oh, I know who it is. It's one of my old rivals. He wanted my wife, and she turned him down and took me. So he's vowed to get me." So the boat is huge now at this stage, and pulls up right beside them. And the fella on board says, "I know it's you, lad of the skins. I know it's you, son of the Rina Ganuk, the king of the hills, but not by your clothing. So, but I know it's you." So he says, it's me. So he stands up with his sword ready, and the fella takes a leap on board, and they fall to fighting. And they start as boys, and they grow old fighting, old men. And then they become puppies, and they grow old dogs. And then they become kittens, and they grow into old cats, fighting all the time. And Fiona's holding the rudder, thinking, "Holy crap." And they turn into foals and horses. And finally, they become birds. And they start as chicks, and they grow older and older. And then the two of them, each of them kills the other, and they're dead on the deck. And Fionn picks up the fellow who arrived and flings him overboard. And he brings back, because he's promised the wife that he'll bring him back dead or alive. So he's bringing back this body of a bird, but he's bringing him back to the wife. And he raises the red flag, and he pulls into the harbour, and she's there waiting, weeping and wailing because he's dead. And he tells her the story, and she's very upset, and she takes his body, and she gets into the boat, and the boat sails off, and it sails for a long, long time. And at one stage, she's sitting there kind of staring into space, and she sees 2 birds fly past, holding a dead bird between them, and they fly. And so she turns the boat and follows them, and they fly and fly and fly, and they reach this little island, and they drop the bird on the island, and they fly up again, and they're circling. And then after a short time, the dead bird resuscitates and flies up and meets them, and they head away. So she says, "Oh, this might work for my fella." So she lands the boat, and she brings him ashore, and she goes, it's just a little bird, so she can carry him anywhere. And she's walking around the island, and there's a huge tree in the middle with great leaves. So she says, "That must be it." So she puts it down and wraps him in the leaves and leaves him at the foot of the tree. And she goes back to the boat, and she waits there for a while. And after a while, the Catholic appears, fully formed, full human again, back to normal. And he kisses her and greets her, and they head back to Ireland because he's owed his wages by Fionn because he's worked his full term. And Fionn, meanwhile, is pretty depressed back home because he's thinking that he's lost his great friend and servant. And there's a knock on the door in the middle of the night, and he said, "Who is it? Who is it?" And he said, "It's someone you owe money to, wages to, not money, but wages." And Fionn says, "I only owe wages to one man, and I'd rather see him than give 6 wages." And he said, "Well, I'm here." So he opens the door and sees him, And he says, yes, it's great. And they hug and he pays him his money and he stays for a while. And after a while, he and his wife head away. And some say they went to Manannán Mac Lir's kingdom because he was her father. So that's the story.
That's a great story. I think that deserves I hope you enjoyed that. It was recorded in front of a live audience at the Working Artists Studios in Ballydehob. And Paul and I would like to thank our friends at Wild Goose Studio in Kinsale for their continued support in making Into the Mythic. If your appetite is whetted for more things ancient, Irish and mythic, we'd love if you'd come and support us on Patreon. We have a new series of short podcasts there about the absolutely intriguing Brehon laws that governed ancient Ireland for thousands of years. We'll be discussing the role of poets and bards, professional farters, and the complex web of law that allowed for 10 different forms of marriage.